Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody that is hopefully for somebody. I am your host, Kyle Naranya. This is the conclusion of my Thanksgiving week in the United States for episodes. I'm going to be totally honest, I'm exhausted, but I did promise that I would do a review of Napoleon, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Joaquin Phoenix. So I have seen it. I am going to review it. As per usual with a film review, there will be a non-spoiler section and a full spoiler section. Timecodes will be listed in the description if you do want to jump around. Before getting into that, I wanted to address something. You probably noticed that the intro is shorter. I did have a comment on a TikTok video that suggested the intro to the show was too long. So I've cut down a shorter version of the track. Let me know on whatever social media you follow the show on what you think. I'm still going to include a full version of the podcast intro in the end of the show, so if you do enjoy listening to it, it is still going to be there. Just going to try this up for a couple weeks, see what the listeners think. But I'm going to be honest, I have a hard time with the short intro. I do like the full version of the song. I'm not going to waste any more time on the intro. Let's get into the non-spoiler review of Napoleon. All right, as mentioned, Napoleon is the latest film from director icon Ridley Scott. And I believe, I mean, this could be something I've completely overlooked, but reuniting with Joaquin Phoenix, who of course was in Gladiator over 20 years ago. Man, time flies. This episode's probably gonna not be everybody's favorite to listen to. I'm just gonna talk through that yawn. And so, I guess I should explain how I was feeling prior to seeing the film. This is an Apple TV film, which is particularly interesting and is getting a theatrical run, the length of which I'm not exactly sure, but the trailers for this pitched it to be this very intense, epic war film. And of course, Joaquin Phoenix is coming off of his win from Joker. Joker 2, of course, currently in production. Filmography, I'm just checking. I don't think he had made anything else. Oh, I guess Beau is Afraid, but I didn't see that. And so, obviously, you've got a star-studded cast amongst Vanessa Kirby, as well as, I'm going to be honest, a lot of people in this are unknown to me. Yeah, there were a lot of new faces in this, which I did quite enjoy. And so, it's interesting that this film covers a substantial amount of Napoleon's life, if not all of the significant portions. And if you've seen the trailers, it pitches this film, or at least presents this film, that has these incredible battle sequences. And I'm going to talk about those as a whole. And I found those to be absolutely incredible. And there is something about practical set pieces that Ridley Scott has mastered going back to, honestly, pretty much every one of his films where that's been the case, where it's been required. And each and all of the battle sequences in this film, all of the major ones that we do see, the Battle of Austerlitz, the Battle of Borodino, I'm trying to look to see really quickly where else there are any, Battle of Waterloo, and particularly the grandeur of this is something that you just do not get to see from films of this nature. Ironically, Last Duel being a film that also had this, but was covering a much more serious subject matter, and the way that the narrative was presented in that film was substantially different. I don't think I've actually covered it on the podcast, but it is a film that is so well crafted, and the performances from top to bottom are so well executed. However, given the subject matter of it being about a woman being raped by a family friend, the subject is very intense and unpleasant, as it should be, and every time you have to consistently revisit what had occurred with Jodie Comer's character, it's not necessarily a viewing experience that you're going to say is entertaining and enjoyable. At least it shouldn't be for most. And so with this film, my biggest issue is, and I've talked about this with friends and family after I saw that, is the balance of tone really threw me for a loop. And that is without getting into overall specifics, I guess like these are generalities, so I don't necessarily mind talking about them in this portion of the review, which is that the grandeur of the practical set pieces and the scope of the production design, the cast that's been assembled is next level. You are getting a high S tier level of cast and script and actors. I already said that. Again, can you tell that I'm very tired? It's been a very long week. As well as direction with Ridley Scott, although the more recent Ridley Scott films have not been necessarily my favorite, with the 2 Alien films, as well as House of Gucci being amongst them, and Exodus Gods and Kings also being in there as well. And so getting this practicality, that's something that Hollywood has been clearly in need of. If you were looking at the other big blockbusters as of late, even the premium television such as Disney Plus, which is clearly using the volume at every other circumstance. And so all of those elements are phenomenal and are so captivating and really worth the big screen experience. Going to your movie theater to see all of these actors on the big screen, these practical battle sequences with incredible stunt work and choreography. And my biggest issue with that is that when it came to the dialogue sequences in this film, the tone is such a dramatic shift into more comedic and real. I think to some degree, the dialogue in particular leans away from the drama. So in my viewing experience, I had quite a hard time and being captivated by the dialogue sequences in particular and the conversations that are being had, particularly with Napoleon and his Empress Josephine, where a lot of that is really, particularly each scene buttons with comedic moments. And I was trying to figure out if the film is trying to have some sort of comment on what was going on during the French Revolution and then hereafter, where Napoleon, I mean, the history books are the history books. They're not technically spoilers, but regardless, I'll avoid that if you would like me to. And in doing so, I felt it really undercut the drama that we were experiencing with the fall of France and that particular monarchy leading into the new council being in charge and Napoleon's rise to power. And whether we are supposed to be taking this character seriously is something I'm very uncertain of. And given, as I mentioned, the seriousness that the action sequences are treated with, and that we get to understand the tactician and the brilliance that Napoleon had in being able to outsmart and outthink is this exact way of saying the same thing, but his tactics were unlike anything anybody else had seen, and that his personality and his thriving goals for success and power, that ultimately being the downfall of him, and his personal life affecting the decisions that he made that ultimately were his downfall. And that drama would be really compelling if it weren't undercut by silly sequences of sex to some degree, and this character not feeling like he's being treated seriously, even amongst the people that he's supposed to be respected by. And so having this dual tone that is inconsistently balanced, in my opinion, really hurted my viewing experience, where I felt like I was on a teeter-totter and I wasn't necessarily sure what to expect. And that lack of balance is something that I think you can do well. And again, this is just my personal opinion, but given the back and forth with that, it felt like you were on as I said, a teeter-totter. And so you're being jerked to two different tones where everything is really serious when we're in the midst of war, but then like, haha, look at these silly. And I don't know if that comes down to the performances that Ridley was looking for. It's certainly different than things we've seen from Joaquin in the past. I think that Vanessa Kirby plays the Empress really well, and the clear indication of she's using the situations at hand to raise her status, and ultimately it increases in a rise of her wealth as well, and that she has this very complicated relationship with Napoleon. And I think Napoleon's insecurities, obviously the height thing is something that he's most famous for, but elements that you are most familiar with, while I can understand why you wouldn't want to present them in the film, you ultimately don't do that here. There were instances where I was curious if they were making Joaquin shorter amongst crowds. Now, that only happened about once or twice, so I'm not necessarily sure if they are decreasing his height for the film, but I really struggled with the inconsistency in tone, and at times I was bored during the dialogue because of that inconsistency. It's unfortunate because I think the grandeur of the film in general does work really well on the big screen. I'm curious if it's going to work better on a streaming platform. Now, the release date on Apple TV, I believe, as of now, hasn't been established. And Ridley Scott has revealed that I guess he has plans for a director's cut that's going to include more things for Empress Josephine. So I'm very curious to see if that's going to make a difference. The film is just over 2.5 hours long. And so it's not long, and I wouldn't consider it dry. But again, I know I've said this multiple times, but my sticking point for this is the inconsistency and lack of balance amongst the film's two dueling tones. So I can't really get into, the details for this are history. I know that the film has been credited with having some inaccuracies when it comes to historical truths and facts. So I guess I'm going to talk about that more specifically in spoilers, but generalities when I'm this tired are as best as they're likely going to be. So I don't really recommend it because the film, I think it's the audience that it might be aiming for is going to be thrown for a loop. If you're expecting this epic war drama, about half of the film is that. But then if you're looking for an analysis of character and maybe that being looked more precisely under a microscope and really getting to know Napoleon specifically, I think you get that to some degree. But again, with a lot of the dialogue and sequences being played on the more comedic spectrum, I think that's going to alienate the two different versions of this movie. So yeah, I'm not overall going to recommend it. I think it is something potentially worth for streaming. So yeah, that'll do it for the non-spoiler section of the review. I'm going to jump into spoilers now. Okay, where do we start? I guess so the French Revolution is happening, and this is going to be plot by plot because otherwise I've kind of run out of stuff today. So follow along with me as I sum up the plot for Napoleon, directed by Ridley Scott. And so as the revolution is happening, we do get the first incredible battle sequence, which is when Napoleon is given the job to... Where does he go? He goes somewhere. Does it even say? So the Siege of Toulon, what I really liked about each of the battle sequences, I'm just going to talk about those because those are the things I enjoyed the most. And that is where we really get to see different tactics used throughout all of the sequences. We get different environments. So the Siege of Toulon specifically is in acquiring the fort that I'm assuming is at Toulon. And so in doing so, one of the main issues that they're having with the British is having to take down their ships. And they manufacture these they're shorter cannons that are capable of being carried by man. Something that, again, I'm not a historian. I'm just going to take the movie's standpoint version of this, which may or may not be correct, and that they are used in order to take over the fort, and then as a result, using all of the cannons based on the fort to take down the ships. And this battle sequence very much clearly reminded me of things we saw specifically in Game of Thrones, whether that was, I believe, the end of season 2, or it might have been season 1. No, season 2, when Tyrion Lannister gets slashed in the face, and then stuff like the Battle of Bastards. And so that action sequences is quite cool. The visceral nature of this movie is, again, something I think is very interesting when you get to see it in the battle sequences and how that tone is not carried over into the dialogue. You see a horse in this film get impaled by a cannonball, and I guess it would be impaled, bludgeoned. either or. The cannonball is in the chest of the horse, taking it down. And then also to stop a rally of, or an insurrection within France, Napoleon takes out a bunch of cannons and starts firing them at citizens, and it looks just as graphic as you would expect it to be. And in having these victories, we see that Napoleon is raising amongst the ranks. He's respected. He is a member of this council that is now in charge of France. And all this power seems to be things that he wants. We also get to see a battle at the pyramids, which was particularly interesting. I'd be curious to see what the visual effects breakdown is. Obviously, I mentioned in the non-spoiler section of the review about the practicality and locations, but obviously you can't fire cannonballs at the actual pyramids. So regardless of actual locations and integration with special effects, even if they are going somewhere and then enhancing the environment with visual effects, it is significantly harder to figure out where that separation may be when you are going to real locations. It is something that I mentioned, I think, in my Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes review, which is they went to a lot of these countries. They went to Europe to shoot, I believe, all of the film and built sets as much as they could, and then would do set extensions, which is quite normal and has been done for a substantial history of Hollywood. And so in this film as well, going to real palaces, the costume design, which is something I don't think I mentioned in the non-spoilers, lived-in clothes is something I know a lot of people have been critical about with Star Wars, particularly the Disney era, which everything seems to be brand new. And that in this film, we really get to see clothing there was a long pause in there. We get to see clothing from every level of the bureaucracy of France, where we see the how-to-do rich councilmen and their well paid for wives or mistresses, and then we see the slums of France and what the separation in economics leads to. And particularly with Josephine de Beauharnais, and apologize for my mispronunciation likely of that, as I haven't taken French in 16, 17 years now at this point. And so their relationship, which I mentioned in the non-spoiler section, is very interesting, where they are definitely using each other. Napoleon specifically is using her because he wants an heir, because whatever his status is and eventually getting crowned emperor, he needs to have an heir to take over. She is incapable of doing so, and we get to see the social dynamics explored between the two of them, particularly where early on in their relationship, just after their marriage, it becomes public that she's sleeping around. And in doing so, it actually forces Napoleon to return from a battle, resulting in a contentious relationship, specifically with some of the council. And eventually there is a coup amongst that, and he does become emperor. And so not having a wife becomes more and more of an issue, and their relationship, again, all of the sex scenes seem to be played comedically, which I don't understand, given the significance and the gravitas of that situation in what they're trying to achieve, particularly Napoleon. And obviously it's just for creating a baby. That's pretty much all it was done for. And each of those scenes there's a slight tinge of humor with them, and I found that to be, I guess it is funny, but it feels off given how a large portion of the film does not feel that way. And so we then get to see what was in the trailer significantly, but getting to see the build out for the Battle of Austerlitz, as the relationships between Austria and Russia have completely deteriorated, and France is continually trying to capture more of the Eastern Hemisphere, resulting in this unity of a relationship between Russia and the Austrians, and the methodicalness to which the plan has been thought out is really interesting. And I thought that was really cool to see what the steps were in being on the winning side. Ironically, they have the higher ground, and assembling a village in the middle of this frozen lake and having it seem completely helpless as the Austrians and the Russians attack it was really cool. And then getting to see the use of slow motion actually in the sequence was really captivating, particularly with the breaking of the frozen ice, the frozen lake, and seeing people, and I'm assuming these horses are completely CG. PETA, you let me know if I'm wrong about that, but I would be shocked if that was the case. And outside of the beginning of this, the visceral nature to the violence is not as dramatic as it is in the earlier film. Like, we see plumes of blood amongst the water, but it's not as graphic as the very first sequence, the Siege of Toulon. And then these relationships, these being the most interesting thing about the film, are that Napoleon keeps Josephine around even after he divorces her and marries somebody else, so that way he can have a son. And this pull to each other, again, because the dialogue between them and each of their one-on-one scenes is tonally inconsistent from some of the other things. It's weird on what this relationship is. You can see that Joachim is, as his Napoleon, is drawn to her and feels this constant pull to her, writing her letters consistently as he goes to invade Russia. And ultimately, it's his complete downfall of push for power that leads into him being exiled by the French, resulting in him going to St. Helena. And I thought that I was really going to enjoy this film. I was quite looking forward to it. And I like how each of the battle sequences, as I said, is done in a different location. And they explore different tactics of fighting in the 19th century. That being the late 1700s and early 1800s. Yeah, that would be the 18th and the 19th century. And so I really like that. Quite honestly, I didn't like Joaquin Phoenix's performance in this. I don't know what that came down to, but the character of Napoleon didn't seem to be somebody where you felt the downfall of his ideology or his goals that he had in mind. Similar, ironically, to Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes that I saw earlier. But all of his relationships just sort of deteriorate because of bad choices he makes, and how France is evolving around him as he's not present to it, and that what he wants to accomplish doesn't necessarily lead in line with what France wants to do. And I mean, I may be completely wrong in this, but that's what I took from the film. I was bored at times. I did feel it to be a little bit long, which I found kind of interesting given how all of the battle sequences are really good, and the performances for the most part are good. I mean, Joaquin's, again, as I said earlier, I didn't know what he was trying to do. And I know he's been critical of his own performance in this, which I found quite interesting. But as a whole, again, I'm not sure what it's trying to say about Napoleon. Maybe somebody smarter than I will explain it to me later. But I think that'll pretty much do it for my spoiler review of Napoleon. I don't really have much else to say, except I'm going to talk about what's coming up in the next coming weeks. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Film Realist podcast. Please let me know on social media what you thought of Napoleon. You can tweet at Film Realists, or my personal one at Kyle_Naranja. That's NORONHA. I'm also on, or the podcast is also on Threads, Hive. I'm on Vero, as well as Facebook. Let me know what, as I said in the beginning, what you think of the shorter intro. If you like the longer one, it's going to still be for the end, not credits, but it's going to end the episodes as per usual. Next week is going to be a review of the first of the 60th anniversary 2023 Doctor Who specials, which was called The Star Beast. Date of recording, I have seen it already, and I'm very much looking forward to talking about it. So that'll be next week. There may be a couple other things in the episode. I haven't really decided what they're going to be. For the upcoming weeks, there's going to be, as long as there is a Doctor Who episode or special, I will be talking about them likely back on the Monday release schedule. This was just a special week with 3 movies that I wanted to see. If you did like the podcast, please share it with your film-loving friends. As always, if you are listening on Spotify, there is a question baked into the episode that I will give you a shout out for and analyze what your answers were on the questions. I don't think anybody wanted to tell me what their favorite song was in Trolls, which is fine. I don't think I would have been able to name all three of them, as well as for the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, what is your favorite YA franchise? Napoleon will have a question baked into it on Spotify. If you did love the show, please give it a 5-star review or any star review on your podcasting platform. I'm Kyle Naranya, one of the film realists. I hope you enjoyed being one yourself. I will see you next week.